The Wyoming wind cut through Tom McKenna's worn coat like a rusty blade, carrying with it the promise of another brutal night. He pulled his hat lower over his weathered face as he walked the fence line of his small ranch, checking for breaks that the recent storms might have torn in the already patched wire. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step a reminder of how alone he was out here, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and 20 from the town of Bitter Creek. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed what remained of his life's work. The barn stood empty. His cattle had succumbed to disease 3 months ago, leaving him with nothing but debts and memories. The house, once filled with Mary's laughter and the smell of her Irish stew, now felt like a tomb. She'd been gone 6 months now, taken by pneumonia during the harsh spring, and Tom had been going through the motions of living ever since. The last of his supplies sat in a sack back at the house. A single loaf of bread, some dried beans, and a small tin of coffee. Enough for maybe 3 days if he was careful. After that, he'd have to swallow his pride and head to town, hat in hand, looking for work or charity. The thought made his stomach turn more than the hunger did. As he reached the far corner of his property, something caught his eye, a dark shape against the white snow, huddled near the fence post. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he approached, his heart lurched. It was a child, a boy no more than 12, with long black hair matted with snow and ice. His lips were blue, his small frame shaking uncontrollably. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," Tom whispered, dropping to his knees beside the child. The boy was Native American, that much was clear from his buckskin clothing and the beaded necklace around his neck. In these parts, that would normally send most white men running for their rifles. The tensions between settlers and the local tribes had been escalating for months, with reports of raids and retaliations on both sides. Sheriff Hayes had been warning everyone to shoot first and ask questions later when it came to Indian troubles. But looking at this child, this dying child, Tom saw nothing but a boy who needed help. The same age his own son would have been if Mary had been able to carry their babies to term. "Can you hear me, lad?" Tom asked softly, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around the small, shivering form. "What's your name?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, revealing brown eyes dulled by pain and exhaustion. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Tom could see the hollow look of starvation in his face, the way his cheeks had sunken in, the way his small hands trembled not just from cold, but from weakness. "Don't try to talk," Tom said, scooping the boy up in his arms. The child weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of sticks wrapped in buckskin. "We need to get you warm." The walk back to the house felt like miles, though it was only a few hundred yards. Tom's own weakness from hunger made each step a struggle, but he pressed on, feeling the boy's labored breathing against his chest. Inside the small cabin, he laid the child on the bed near the fireplace and began building up the fire with his last pieces of good wood. As warmth began to fill the room, Tom knelt beside the bed and carefully removed the boy's snow-soaked moccasins. The child's feet were white with frostbite, and Tom knew he had to act fast. He heated water in his only pot and began the slow process of warming the boy's extremities, all while watching for signs of consciousness. The boy's eyes opened again as feeling returned to his limbs, and this time he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Water." Tom held a cup to the boy's lips, letting him drink slowly. "Easy now, not too fast." When the boy had taken enough water, he looked up at Tom with those dark eyes and said something in his native tongue. Tom didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear, gratitude mixed with wariness. "My name's Tom," he said gently. "Tom McKenna. You're safe here." The boy studied his face for a long moment, then spoke again, this time in broken English. "Little Hawk, I am. Little Hawk. Well, Little Hawk, you're going to be all right, but you need food." Tom stood and looked toward the kitchen area, where his last loaf of bread sat on the wooden table. His stomach had been gnawing at him for hours, and he'd been planning to make that bread last 2 days. But looking at this child, he knew there was really no choice at all. He cut the entire loaf into thick slices, toasted them by the fire, and brought them to the boy. "Here you go, lad. Eat slowly now." Little Hawk's eyes widened as he took the bread, and Tom saw a flash of something, surprise perhaps, or confusion. The boy ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days, and Tom felt a deep satisfaction watching color return to the child's cheeks. "Where's your family, Little Hawk?" Tom asked as the boy ate. "How did you come to be out there alone?" The boy's expression darkened and he spoke haltingly in his broken English. "Bluecoats came. Big fight. Got lost in snow. Walked many days. He touched his chest. Grandfather, he looks for me. Tom nodded, understanding. A military patrol had likely attacked the boy's camp, and in the chaos he'd gotten separated from his people. The child had probably been wandering the wilderness for days, slowly starving and freezing to death. As Little Hawk finished the last of the bread, Tom made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't turn this child out into the cold, not when doing so would mean certain death. And he couldn't take him to town. Sheriff Hayes would likely lock the boy up or worse, and the townspeople's fear and prejudice would make him a target. "You'll stay here tonight," Tom said firmly. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Little Hawk nodded, exhaustion overcoming his wariness. As the boy fell asleep by the fire, Tom sat in his chair and stared out the window at the snow-covered landscape. He'd just given away his last food to a child whose people were considered enemies by everyone he knew. Come morning, he'd have to face the consequences of that choice. But as he watched the boy sleep peacefully for the first time in days, Tom McKenna knew he'd made the right decision. Some things were more important than politics or prejudice. Some things were simply about being human. Tom woke before dawn to the sound of Little Hawk moving around the cabin. The boy was standing by the window, silhouetted against the pale morning light, his small frame tense with alertness. He'd wrapped Tom's old blanket around his shoulders like a cape, and his dark eyes were scanning the horizon with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "See something out there?" Tom asked softly, not wanting to startle the child. Little Hawk turned, and Tom was relieved to see that the boy's color had improved overnight. The deathly pallor was gone, replaced by the natural bronze of his skin, and his eyes had regained some of their brightness. "Always watch," Little Hawk said in his careful English. "Grandfather, teach me. Sky speaks before danger comes." Tom joined him at the window, noting the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. "Looks like more snow coming. Good thing we got you inside when we did." The boy nodded, then looked up at Tom with an expression that seemed far too old for his young face. "Why you help me? Your people and my people." He struggled for the words, then made a gesture that suggested conflict. "Because you're a child who needed help," Tom said simply. "That's all that matters." Little Hawk studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand this white man who didn't fit into any category he'd been taught to expect. "In my tribe we have saying, good heart speaks all languages. You have good heart, Tom McKenna." The simple words hit Tom harder than he expected. It had been so long since anyone had seen anything good in him. Since Mary died, he'd felt like a failure, a man who couldn't even keep his cattle alive or his wife healthy. But this boy, this child from a completely different world, saw something worth saving. "Well," Tom said, clearing his throat, "good heart or not, we need to get some food in you. All I've got left is some beans and coffee, but we'll make do." As Tom prepared their meager breakfast, Little Hawk sat at the wooden table and began to tell his story. His English was limited, but mixed with gestures and the occasional word in Lakota, he painted a picture of a life that was both foreign and familiar to Tom. "My grandfather is Chief Standing Bear," Little Hawk said with obvious pride. "He is great warrior, but also wise man. He teach me to read sky, to track animals, to know which plants heal and which ones hurt." The boy's expression darkened. "But white soldiers come 3 suns ago. They say we must go to reservation. Grandfather say we harm no one. We only hunt for food because government food is bad, makes children sick." Tom nodded, having heard stories about the poor quality of government rations provided to the reservations. "What happened then?" "Soldiers angry. They shoot first, ask questions after. Many horses scattered, people running everywhere. I try to follow, but storm come. Snow so thick cannot see." Little Hawk's voice grew quiet. "Walk for many days, eat bark snow, think I will die like winter rabbit." The image of this child wandering alone through the blizzard, slowly starving, made Tom's chest tighten. "But you didn't die. You're tough, like your grandfather." Little Hawk smiled for the first time since Tom had found him. "Grandfather say I have strong spirit, like hawk that flies high even in storm." They ate their beans in comfortable silence, and Tom found himself studying the boy. Despite everything Little Hawk had been through, there was a resilience about him, a quiet strength that reminded Tom of the Irish children he'd known growing up in Boston, kids who'd survived poverty and prejudice through sheer determination. "Tom McKenna," Little Hawk said suddenly, "you have family, wife, children." The question hit like a physical blow. Tom set down his spoon and stared at the table. "Had a wife, Mary. She died last spring. Never had children that lived." He looked up at the boy. "What about you? Besides your grandfather?" Mother died when I was small. Father killed by soldiers 2 winters ago. Grandfather is all I have." Little Hawk's voice was matter-of-fact, but Tom could see the pain beneath the surface. "We are same, I think. Alone men." "I suppose we are," Tom said quietly. The morning passed with Tom showing Little Hawk around the small ranch, explaining how he'd built the cabin with his own hands, how he'd once raised cattle on the land, how he'd dreamed of making a life here with Mary. The boy was a quick learner, asking intelligent questions about everything from the construction of the barn to the patterns of the weather. "You know much about land," Little Hawk observed as they stood in the barn. "Like my people know. White men in town, they do not understand. They think land is something to own, like blanket or horse. But you know land is something to know, to live with." Tom was struck by the boy's insight. Mary used to say the same thing. She'd say the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. "Your Mary sound like wise woman, like my grandmother was." "She was. Wiser than me, that's for sure." It was past noon when they heard the sound of horses approaching. Tom's blood ran cold as he recognized the voices, rough, loud, and angry. He quickly moved to the window and saw 3 riders approaching the cabin. Sheriff Hayes led the group, his badge glinting in the pale sunlight. Behind him rode Jake Morrison and Pete Daniels, 2 men known for their hatred of Native Americans and their quick tempers. "Little Hawk," Tom said urgently, "you need to hide. Now, get under the bed and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." The boy's eyes widened with understanding, and he quickly obeyed, disappearing beneath the quilts. Tom straightened his shoulders and stepped outside to meet the men, closing the door firmly behind him. "Morning, Sheriff," Tom said, keeping his voice casual despite the hammering of his heart. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Hayes was a big man with a gray beard and cold blue eyes. He dismounted and approached Tom with the swagger of someone used to intimidating others. "Got reports of Indian sign in the area, McKenna. Fresh tracks leading toward your property." "Haven't seen any Indians," Tom replied truthfully. He'd found Little Hawk collapsed in the snow. There hadn't been any tracks to speak of. Jake Morrison, a lean man with a permanently angry expression, spat into the snow. "We heard different. Word is you've been harboring a redskin boy." Tom's blood turned to ice. Someone had seen something, or suspected something. "Who told you that?" "Don't matter who," Sheriff Hayes said. "What matters is whether it's true. Mind if we take a look around?" Tom stepped slightly to the side, blocking the path to his door. "I mind plenty. This is my land, and I haven't broken any laws." "Harboring hostile Indians is against the law," Pete Daniels said, his hand moving toward his gun, "especially when they're from Standing Bear's band. That old chief's been raiding settlements for months." "I told you I haven't seen any Indians," Tom repeated, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Sheriff Hayes stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Tom, I've known you for 3 years. You're not a liar, but you're not telling me the whole truth either. If you've got something to hide, now's the time to come clean." Inside the cabin, Tom knew Little Hawk was listening to every word, probably terrified. The boy had already lost his parents to violence, had been separated from his grandfather, had nearly died alone in the wilderness. Tom couldn't let him fall into the hands of men like these. "I've got nothing to hide," Tom said firmly. "Now, if you gentlemen don't mind, I've got work to do." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Tom could see the suspicion in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but they also didn't have proof, yet. "We'll be keeping an eye on you, McKenna," Sheriff Hayes said as he remounted his horse. "And if we find out you've been lying to us, there'll be consequences." As the 3 men rode away, Tom stood in the doorway until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again. He went back inside and found Little Hawk emerging from beneath the bed, his young face pale but determined. "They will come back," the boy said quietly. "They do not trust you now." Tom nodded grimly. "I know, which means we need to figure out what to do next." But even as he said it, Tom realized he'd already made his choice. He wasn't going to turn this child over to men who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved. Whatever came next, he'd face it with Little Hawk by his side. The blizzard struck that evening with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Snow pelted the windows like rifle shot, and the wind howled through every crack in the walls, making the fire dance and flicker in the hearth. Tom and Little Hawk huddled close to the warmth, sharing the last of the coffee and watching the storm rage outside. "Grandfather say storms like this are spirits angry," Little Hawk said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Maybe angry because families torn apart." Tom nodded, thinking of the boy's words from earlier. The child had an understanding of the world that went beyond his years, shaped by loss and hardship, but not yet hardened by bitterness. "Maybe the spirits are angry at all of us," Tom said. "White and Indian alike. Maybe we've all forgotten how to be human to each other." Little Hawk studied Tom's weathered face in the firelight. "You different from other white men, I see. Why?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "My people came from Ireland. We were treated like animals by the English. Beaten, starved, told we were less than human because of who we were. When we came to America, we thought we'd find something better, but I've seen how we treat your people, and it's the same hatred, just with different faces." "You understand," Little Hawk said simply. "That is why you helped me." "I suppose it is." The storm continued through the night, and by morning, the world outside was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Tom knew that the blizzard would keep Sheriff Hayes and his men away for at least another day, but it also meant that Little Hawk's grandfather and his people would have difficulty searching for the boy. As they shared their meager breakfast of the last of the beans, Little Hawk became increasingly agitated. He kept looking toward the window, his young face creased with worry. "Grandfather will think I am dead," he said finally. "He will mourn for me, and I will never see him again." Tom set down his cup and looked at the boy. "What if there was a way to let him know you're alive, to send him a message?" Little Hawk's eyes brightened with hope. "How? Storm too bad for traveling." "Not for traveling, maybe, but what about smoke signals? Could you make a fire that would tell your grandfather you're alive?" The boy's face lit up with excitement. "Yes, but must be right kind of fire, right place, and must wait for storm to pass, for air to be still." They spent the morning planning. Little Hawk explained the traditional methods of smoke signaling used by his people, how different patterns of smoke conveyed different messages, how the signals could be read from miles away on a clear day. Tom listened intently, marveling at the sophistication of the communication system. "There is hill, maybe 2 miles from here," Little Hawk said, pointing toward the east. "High place, good for signals. If I make fire there when storm ends, grandfather will see." "We'll make the fire there," Tom corrected. "I'm not letting you go alone." Little Hawk looked surprised. "You would help me signal to my people, even though your people would be angry?" "My people are already angry," Tom said grimly. "Might as well give them a good reason." By afternoon, the storm had begun to weaken, though snow continued to fall steadily. Little Hawk taught Tom the basics of smoke signaling, showing him how to create different patterns by controlling the airflow to the fire. Tom found himself fascinated by the complexity of the system. It was like learning a new language, one written in smoke and wind. "This signal means alive," Little Hawk explained, demonstrating with small puffs of smoke from the fireplace. "This one means help needed, and this," he created a longer, more complex pattern. "This tells grandfather it is me, Little Hawk, his grandson." As evening approached, the snow finally stopped and the wind died to a whisper. Tom and Little Hawk prepared for their journey to the signaling hill. Tom packed his rifle and what little food remained, while Little Hawk gathered materials for the signal fire, special grasses and bark that would create the right kind of smoke. "Are you sure about this, lad?" Tom asked, as they prepared to leave. "Once we send that signal, there's no going back. Your grandfather will know where you are, but so will anyone else who sees the smoke." Little Hawk met his eyes with a steady gaze. "I must try. Grandfather is old, but he is strong. He will not stop looking for me until he knows I am dead or safe." The journey to the hill was treacherous in the deep snow, but Tom's knowledge of the land and Little Hawk's natural agility got them through. The boy moved through the drifts with surprising grace, his moccasins finding perches where Tom's boots slipped. By the time they reached the summit, both were exhausted but determined. The hill offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory. To the east, Tom could see the vast expanse of the Great Plains rolling away toward the horizon. To the west, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the star-filled sky. And somewhere out there he knew an old chief was searching for his grandson. Little Hawk worked quickly to build the signal fire, arranging the wood and tinder with practiced skill. When the flames were burning steady and bright, he began adding the special materials that would create the smoke they needed. "Now," he said, handing Tom a thick piece of bark, "help me make the signals." Together, they worked to create the complex pattern of smoke puffs that would identify Little Hawk to his grandfather. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, a white column against the dark sky that could be seen for miles. "How long do we wait?" Tom asked. "Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours," Little Hawk replied. "Grandfather will see when spirits want him to see." They maintained the fire for over an hour, repeatedly sending the identification signal. Tom was beginning to think the attempt had failed when Little Hawk suddenly gripped his arm. "There," the boy whispered, pointing toward the northeast. Tom squinted into the darkness and saw it, a distant flicker of fire on a far hill, maybe 10 miles away. As they watched, the fire began to pulse in a regular pattern, creating its own smoke signals. Little Hawk's face was radiant with joy. "Grandfather," he answers. "He says he sees me, he comes for me." The boy quickly began sending a new series of signals, and Tom watched in amazement as the distant fire responded. It was like watching a conversation between the hills themselves, conducted in a language older than any written word. "What are you telling him?" Tom asked. "I tell him I'm safe. That white man helps me. I tell him white man is friend, not enemy." Little Hawk paused in his signaling to look at Tom. "Is true, yes, you are friend?" Tom felt something tighten in his chest. "Yes, lad, I'm your friend." The signaling continued for another 20 minutes, with Little Hawk receiving increasingly detailed messages from his grandfather. Finally, the boy sat back from the fire, his face grave. "What did he say?" Tom asked. "Grandfather comes with warriors at dawn. He brings many men because he does not know if trap or if you truly friend. He says if you are good man, you will be honored. If you are bad man," Little Hawk shrugged. "He will know." Tom nodded slowly. "How many warriors?" "Grandfather is great chief. When he rides to war or to honor, he brings all the men, maybe 500. 400 or 500 mounted Lakota warriors." Tom felt his mouth go dry. Even if they came in peace, the sight of that many Native Americans approaching a white settlement would cause panic. Sheriff Hayes and every man in Bitter Creek would assume it was a war party. "Little Hawk," Tom said carefully, "when your grandfather arrives, there could be trouble. My people will be frightened. They might try to fight." The boy nodded soberly. "Grandfather knows this. He says if you are truly friend, you will stand with us when sun rises. You will show your people that not all white men have hearts of stone." Tom looked out across the snow-covered landscape, toward the town of Bitter Creek where he'd bought supplies, where he'd buried his wife, where he'd tried to make a life. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between the world he'd known and the friendship of a child who'd lost everything. "Then I guess we'd better get some sleep," Tom said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As they banked the fire and prepared to return to the cabin, Tom felt the weight of what was coming. At dawn, 500 Lakota warriors would arrive at his fence line, and with them would come a moment of truth that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone in the territory. He'd given his last bread to a starving child, and now he was about to pay the price or reap the reward of that simple act of kindness. Tom woke in the hour before dawn to the sound of hoofbeats, not the thunder of a charge, but the steady rhythm of many horses moving in formation. He rose quietly from his chair by the fire, where he'd spent the night keeping watch, and peered through the frost-covered window. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. They stretched across the horizon like a living wall, hundreds of mounted warriors silhouetted against the pale pre-dawn sky. Even in the dim light, he could see the disciplined way they held their formation, the proud bearing of men who rode as if they were part of their horses. Steam rose from the animals' nostrils in the cold air, and the soft jingle of bridles and the creak of leather carried on the still morning air. "Grandfather comes," Little Hawk said softly from behind him. Tom turned to see the boy standing by the bed, fully dressed in his buckskin clothing, his young face solemn but unafraid. "Are you ready for this, lad?" Little Hawk nodded. "I have been ready since the night you found me. Question is, are you ready?" Tom looked back at the assembled warriors, then at the boy who'd changed everything. "I suppose we're about to find out." They stepped outside together, Tom's boots crunching in the snow, Little Hawk moving silently beside him. The cold air hit them like a physical blow, but neither flinched. As they walked toward the fence line, Tom could see the warriors more clearly now. Painted faces, eagle feathers, weapons at the ready but not raised in threat. At their head rode an older man, whose bearing commanded respect even at a distance. "That's him," Little Hawk said with unmistakable pride. "Chief Standing Bear, my grandfather." The chief was a tall man, probably in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair that fell to his shoulders, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood, and even from 50 yards away, Tom could feel the power of his presence. Standing Bear raised his hand, and the entire formation came to a halt. The silence was profound, 500 men and horses perfectly still, waiting for their leader's command. The chief then rode forward alone, his eyes fixed on Tom and Little Hawk. When he was 20 feet away, Standing Bear dismounted and walked the remaining distance. Tom found himself looking into the weathered face of a man who'd seen much sorrow and much joy, who'd led his people through wars and peace, who'd lost children and grandchildren to the endless conflicts of the frontier. Little Hawk ran to his grandfather, and the old chief's stern expression melted into one of pure joy. He gathered the boy into his arms, speaking rapidly in Lakota, his voice thick with emotion. Tom watched, feeling both happiness for the reunion and uncertainty about his own fate. After a long moment, Standing Bear set Little Hawk down and turned to face Tom. The chief's eyes studied him intently, and Tom forced himself to meet that gaze steadily. He'd learned long ago that running from judgment only made it harsher. "You are the one called Tom McKenna," Standing Bear said, in accented but clear English. "The one who saved my grandson's life." "I am," Tom replied simply. "And your chief, Standing Bear. Your grandson speaks of you with great respect." The chief nodded slowly. "Little Hawk tells me you gave him your last food, that you risked the anger of your own people to keep him safe. Is this true?" Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Any decent man would have done the same." "No," Standing Bear said firmly. "Many men would have let him die. Many have." The chief's expression was grave. "My grandson also tells me that your woman is gone, that you have no children of your own. Yet you chose to save the child of your enemy." "He wasn't my enemy," Tom said. "He was a boy who needed help." Standing Bear studied him for another long moment, then turned and spoke to Little Hawk in Lakota. The boy nodded eagerly and ran back toward the assembled warriors. He returned moments later, carrying a magnificent buffalo robe, its hide decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols. "This belonged to my son," Standing Bear said, accepting the robe from Little Hawk. "Little Hawk's father. He was a brave warrior, a good man. The soldiers killed him 2 winters ago." The chief's voice was steady, but Tom could hear the pain beneath it. "I want you to have this. It is a gift from one father to another." Tom felt his throat tighten. "I'm honored, Chief, but I'm not a father. I never had that blessing." "You saved my grandson's life," Standing Bear said, placing the robe in Tom's hands. "That makes you part of his family, part of my family. You are a father now, whether you choose to be or not." The weight of the robe in his hands seemed to carry the weight of that declaration. Tom looked at Little Hawk, who was beaming with pride, then back at the chief. "I don't know what to say," Tom admitted. "Say you will continue to be the man you showed yourself to be," Standing Bear replied. "Say you will remember that children are sacred, no matter the color of their skin or the language they speak." Before Tom could respond, the sound of approaching horses came from the direction of town. He turned to see a dust cloud rising on the horizon, riders coming fast and hard. His heart sank as he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Hayes, followed by what looked like half the men from Bitter Creek. "Trouble comes," Standing Bear said calmly, but Tom could see the chief's warriors shifting in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. "They're afraid," Tom said quickly. "They see your warriors and they think it's an attack." Standing Bear nodded. "Fear makes men do foolish things, but we came in peace, and we will leave in peace if possible." The approaching riders, Tom counted at least 30 men, came to a halt about 100 yards away. Sheriff Hayes rode forward, his rifle in his hands but not yet raised. Tom could see the fear and anger in the man's face, the way his eyes darted between the assembled warriors and Tom standing with the chief. "McKenna!" Hayes shouted. "Step away from them. Now!" Tom felt Little Hawk move closer to his side, and he placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm fine where I am, Sheriff. You're harboring hostiles," Hayes called back. "That's a federal crime." Standing Bear stepped forward, his hands clearly visible and empty. "I am Chief Standing Bear of the Lakota. I come in peace to reclaim my grandson, who was lost in the storm. This man," he gestured toward Tom, "saved the boy's life. He is under my protection." "I don't care who you are," Hayes shouted, raising his rifle. "You're trespassing on American soil with a war party." "This is not a war party," Standing Bear replied with dignity. "These are my people, come to honor a man who showed kindness to a child." Tom could see the situation spiraling toward violence. The men from town were outnumbered, but they were afraid and desperate. The warriors, despite their chief's calm demeanor, were ready to fight if threatened. One wrong move, one shot fired in panic or anger, and dozens of people would die. "Sheriff Hayes," Tom called out, stepping forward. "These people came in peace. They're taking the boy and leaving. There's no need for bloodshed." "You're a traitor, McKenna," Jake Morrison shouted from behind the sheriff. "Siding with savages against your own kind." My own kind? Tom felt anger flare in his chest. You mean the kind of men who would let a child die in the snow because of the color of his skin? That's enough, Hayes barked. You're coming with us, McKenna. You can explain yourself to the territorial judge. He goes nowhere, Standing Bear said firmly. This man is under my protection. Any who would harm him will answer to me and all my warriors. The two groups faced each other across the snowy ground, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Tom could see fingers tightening on triggers, horses shifting nervously, men on both sides preparing for violence. It was Little Hawk who broke the standoff. The boy stepped forward, placing himself between the two groups, his young voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Stop!" he called out in English, then repeated it in Lakota. "No fighting. No one die for Little Hawk." The boy turned to address the men from town, his English careful but clear. "Tom McKenna saved my life. He give me food when he have no food. He keep me warm when I was dying. He is good man. Why you want to hurt good man?" Tom saw some of the townsmen exchange glances, uncertainty replacing some of the anger on their faces. A few lowered their weapons slightly. "Because he's a redskin lover," Pete Daniels spat, "and that makes him as bad as them." "No," said a new voice. Tom turned to see Sarah Connor, the schoolteacher, riding up behind the group of men. She was a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes, one of the few people in Bitter Creek who'd ever shown him real kindness after Mary's death. "Tom McKenna is a good man," Sarah said loudly, her voice carrying across the field. "He nursed my sister through pneumonia 2 years ago, asked for nothing in return. He's helped half the families in this territory at one time or another, and never asked for payment." She rode closer to Sheriff Hayes, her chin raised defiantly. "If saving a child's life makes him a traitor, then I'm proud to know him." Tom felt tears threaten his eyes. In all his years on the frontier, he'd never had anyone stand up for him like this. Standing Bear stepped forward again, his voice calm but commanding. "We came to honor this man and reclaim our child. Both are done. We will leave in peace, and we will remember that there is at least one white man whose heart is not made of stone." The chief turned to Tom and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will always be welcome in my lodge, Tom McKenna. You are family now." As the warriors began to form up for departure, Little Hawk hugged Tom fiercely. "Thank you," the boy whispered, "for everything." Tom knelt down to the boy's level. "You take care of yourself, lad. And remember, you're stronger than you know." Little Hawk nodded, then pulled something from around his neck, a small carved hawk made from bone. "For you," he said, pressing it into Tom's hand. "So you remember Little Hawk thinks of you as father." As the boy rejoined his grandfather, Tom stood up, clutching the small carving. The buffalo robe was still draped over his arm, and he could feel the weight of both gifts, not just their physical weight, but the responsibility they represented. Standing Bear mounted his horse and raised his hand. As one, the warriors began to move, not in retreat but in dignified withdrawal. As they rode away, Tom could see Little Hawk looking back over his shoulder, waving until the formation disappeared over the ridge. The silence that followed was broken by Sheriff Hayes spitting into the snow. "This isn't over, McKenna. Harboring hostiles is still a crime." But Tom could see that some of the fight had gone out of the men from town. Sarah Connor's words had reminded them of who he was, and Little Hawk's dignity had shown them something they hadn't expected to see. As the townsmen began to disperse, Tom stood alone in his yard, holding the gifts from a boy who'd changed his life forever. The sun was fully up now, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day. 3 weeks had passed since the dawn when 500 Lakota warriors lined Tom McKenna's fence, and the territory was still talking about it. In the saloons of Bitter Creek, in the general store around kitchen tables and campfires, people debated what had really happened that morning. Some called Tom a hero, others a fool, and a few still whispered the word traitor. Tom himself had spent those weeks in a strange kind of limbo. Sheriff Hayes had made it clear that he was watching every move Tom made, waiting for an excuse to arrest him. Several of the more hostile townspeople had made veiled threats, and Tom had found his credit cut off at the general store. But others, people like Sarah Connor and Doc Henderson, had made a point of showing their support. The buffalo robe hung on his cabin wall now, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made and the family he'd gained. The carved hawk sat on his mantle, and sometimes in the evening firelight he could almost hear Little Hawk's voice explaining the meaning of different smoke signals. On this particular morning, Tom was chopping wood behind his cabin when he heard horses approaching. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but he relaxed when he saw it was Sarah Connor, accompanied by a man he didn't recognize. a well-dressed stranger wearing the collar of a preacher. "Morning, Tom," Sarah called out as they dismounted. "I'd like you to meet Reverend David Mitchell. He's come all the way from Denver to speak with you." Tom set down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants. "Preacher, is it? Well, I suppose my soul could use some tending. Though I should warn you, Reverend, I'm not much for church these days." Reverend Mitchell was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair. He extended his hand with a warm smile. "Actually, Mr. McKenna, I'm here because of what you've already done, not what you haven't. Word of your actions has reached Denver and beyond." Tom shook the man's hand, puzzled. "I'm not sure I follow you, Reverend." "May we sit?" Sarah asked. "David has quite a story to tell." They settled on the rough wooden bench Tom had built outside his cabin, and Reverend Mitchell pulled out a worn newspaper from his coat pocket. "This appeared in the Denver Post a week ago," he said, unfolding the paper. The headline reads, "Rancher's Kindness Prevents Massacre in Wyoming Territory." Tom stared at the newspaper in amazement. Who told them? "The story has been told and retold across the territory," Sarah explained. "Some of the men who were there that morning talked about it when they went to Cheyenne for supplies. A journalist heard the story and tracked down more details." Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat and began to read. "In an age when conflicts between settlers and native tribes too often end in bloodshed, one man's simple act of compassion has shown another way. Thomas McKenna, a widowed rancher near Bitter Creek, Wyoming, chose to save the life of a starving Lakota child, sharing his last food with the boy despite the risk to himself. When the child's grandfather, Chief Standing Bear, arrived with hundreds of warriors to reclaim his grandson, what could have been a massacre became instead a ceremony of honor. McKenna's actions remind us that humanity transcends the artificial barriers we create, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in taking a life, but in saving one." Tom sat in stunned silence as the Reverend continued reading. The article described the standoff with Sheriff Hayes, the peaceful resolution and the respect shown by both Standing Bear and the townspeople who had defended Tom. "There's more," Reverend Mitchell said. "This story has been picked up by newspapers in St. Louis, Chicago, even New York. People across the country are talking about what happened here." "But why?" Tom asked. "I just did what anyone should have done." "That's exactly why it matters," Sarah said gently. "Because in these times not everyone would have done what you did. You showed that there's another way." Reverend Mitchell folded the newspaper and looked at Tom seriously. "Mr. McKenna, I represent a group of churches and humanitarian organizations in Denver. We're starting a school, a place where white and native children can learn together, where we can build understanding instead of hatred. We'd like you to help us." Tom laughed, though not unkindly. "Reverend, I appreciate the thought, but I'm just a rancher. I don't know anything about teaching children." "You know about treating them with dignity," the Reverend replied. "You know about seeing past their skin color to their humanity. That's more important than any lesson in a book." "Think about it, Tom," Sarah urged. "You could make a real difference, and—" She hesitated, then continued, "It would give you a fresh start. Away from Sheriff Hayes and the people here who can't see past their prejudices." Tom stood up and walked to his fence line, looking out over the snow-covered landscape where he'd found Little Hawk dying just a month ago. The memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. The boy's blue lips, his frightened eyes, the way he'd eaten that bread like it was the finest meal he'd ever tasted. "What kind of school are you talking about?" he asked finally. Reverend Mitchell joined him at the fence. "A place where children can learn to read and write, yes, but also where they can learn each other's languages, each other's ways, where a white child might learn to read smoke signals, and a native child might learn arithmetic, where they can grow up seeing each other as friends instead of enemies." The idea was revolutionary, Tom knew. Most white settlers would be horrified at the thought of their children learning alongside savages, and many native tribes would be equally suspicious of any white institution. But maybe that was exactly why it was needed. "Where would this school be?" Tom asked. "There's a valley about 50 miles south of Denver," Sarah said. "Good land, fresh water, far enough from town that people wouldn't interfere, but close enough that we could get supplies. The government has agreed to donate the land if we can make it work." Tom was quiet for a long moment, thinking, what about Little Hawk? Would his grandfather allow him to attend such a school? Reverend Mitchell smiled. "We've already spoken with Chief Standing Bear. He said he would trust any institution that you were part of. In fact, he said that if Tom McKenna vouched for the school, he would send not just Little Hawk, but several children from his tribe." The thought of seeing Little Hawk again, of watching him learn and grow in a place where he would be valued for who he was, filled Tom with a warmth he hadn't felt since Mary died. And the White families, would they really send their children? Some will, Sarah said honestly. Not all, maybe not even most at first, but some parents are tired of raising their children to hate. Some want something better. Tom thought of his own childhood in Boston, of the Irish children who'd been spat upon and called animals by their English teachers. He thought of Mary, who dreamed of having children they could raise to be better than the generation that came before. If I said yes, Tom said slowly, what would I do there? Teach them about the land, Reverend Mitchell suggested. About farming, about animals, about how to live in harmony with their environment. Both cultures have wisdom to share about these things. And help them understand each other, Sarah added. You've bridged that gap yourself. You could help children do the same. Tom looked down at the carved hawk in his hand. He'd been carrying it with him everywhere since Little Hawk gave it to him. Such a small thing, but it represented something enormous. The possibility that understanding could triumph over hatred, that kindness could be stronger than fear. When would you need an answer, he asked. The spring, Reverend Mitchell said. Classes would start in September after the building is finished. That gives you time to think, to prepare. As the Reverend and Sarah prepared to leave, Tom walked them to their horses. Thank you for thinking of me, he said. I truly am honored. Tom, Sarah said as she mounted her horse, whatever you decide, you should know that what you did mattered. Not just to Little Hawk, but to all of us who saw it. You reminded us of who we can be at our best. That evening, Tom sat by his fire, the buffalo robe draped over his shoulders, the carved hawk in his hands. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside the cabin was warm and peaceful. For the first time in months, Tom felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. 3 days later, he was awakened before dawn by a familiar sound, hoofbeats in the snow. But this time there was only one horse, and the rider who approached the cabin was small and alone. Tom stepped outside to see Little Hawk sliding down from his pony, a wide grin on his young face. Tom McKenna, the boy called out. I come to visit my white father. Tom felt his heart swell as he embraced the child. Little Hawk, what are you doing here? Is your grandfather with you? Grandfather waits on hill, Little Hawk said, pointing toward the ridge. He says I may visit for one day to speak with you of important things. As they sat by the fire sharing breakfast, Little Hawk told Tom about life with his tribe since their reunion. The boy had been honored among his people for his survival skills and his ability to bridge the gap between cultures. More importantly, he'd been telling stories about Tom, stories that had spread beyond Standing Bear's band to other tribes. Grandfather says white preacher came to speak of school, Little Hawk said. School where white children and Lakota children learn together. Grandfather wants to know, will Tom McKenna be there? Tom looked into the boy's hopeful eyes. Would you want me to be there? Yes, Little Hawk said immediately. I want to learn white man's writing, white man's numbers. But I want to teach white children about our ways too, and I want you to be there because you understand both worlds. It wouldn't be easy, Tom warned. Some people would be angry on both sides. There might be trouble. Little Hawk's expression grew serious, and Tom could see the old wisdom in his young eyes. Grandfather says anything worth doing brings trouble at first, but if we do not try, nothing changes. Children grow up to hate just like their parents. That afternoon, as Little Hawk prepared to return to his tribe, he pressed something into Tom's hand, a small piece of birch bark covered with symbols. What's this? Tom asked. Lakota writing, Little Hawk explained proudly. I teach myself to make white man's words in our symbols. This says, Tom McKenna is my father, and I am proud. Tom felt tears threaten his eyes. Little Hawk, You saved my life, the boy said simply. But more than that, you saved my faith that good people exist in all tribes. That is worth more than life. As Tom watched Little Hawk ride away toward the hill where his grandfather waited, he made his decision. He would go to Denver. He would help build that school. He would try to create a place where children like Little Hawk could grow up seeing the best in each other instead of the worst. The next morning, Tom began making preparations for his journey. He would leave in the spring, when the snow melted and the passes were clear. He would take with him the buffalo robe, the carved hawk, and the birch bark message, symbols of the family he'd gained and the future he hoped to help build. As he worked, he thought about Mary and how proud she would have been. She'd always believed that love was stronger than hate, that kindness could change the world one heart at a time. She'd been right, Tom realized. It just took the right moment, the right choice to prove it. The wind across the plains carried the promise of spring, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. Tom McKenna had given his last bread to a starving child, and in return, he'd received something more valuable than gold, a purpose worth living for, and the knowledge that even in the darkest times, one act of kindness could light the way forward. In the distance, smoke signals rose from the hills, not warnings of war, but messages of hope, carried on the wind toward a future where children of all colors might learn to see each other not as enemies, but as family.